Imagine this. You're sitting across from someone who has taken everything from you: your time, your energy, your peace of mind, and yet, as they speak, you find yourself nodding in understanding. They explain their struggles, their pain, their endless needs, and despite the exhaustion burning behind your eyes, despite the resentment you've been swallowing for months, you hear yourself saying, "I understand. It's okay. I'm here for you." In that moment, you realize something terrifying. Your greatest strength has become your most dangerous weakness. This is the paradox that Niccolò Machiavelli understood 5 centuries ago, long before psychology had words for it, long before we pathologized the very qualities we once called virtues. In a world that tells you empathy is the highest form of human evolution, that caring for others is the mark of a good person, that your ability to feel what others feel makes you morally superior, Machiavelli saw something else entirely. He saw a weapon being turned against its wielder. Picture the most empathetic person you know. Really see them in your mind. Notice how they carry themselves: shoulders slightly slumped from the weight of everyone else's problems, eyes that seem to see too much, hands that are always reaching out to comfort someone. Now ask yourself this. When was the last time you saw them truly, genuinely happy? Not just momentarily pleased by someone else's success, not just satisfied by solving another person's crisis, but deeply, authentically content with their own existence? The silence that follows this question is where Machiavelli's wisdom begins to reveal itself. You see, empathy without boundaries isn't compassion. It's self-destruction disguised as virtue. It's the slow suicide of the soul, performed one act of kindness at a time. And the most insidious part? Society applauds you for it. Your family praises you for being so caring. Your friends rely on you being their emotional dumping ground. Your colleagues know you'll always say yes, always stay late, always absorb their stress without complaint. But Machiavelli knew something that modern psychology is only beginning to understand. There are people in this world who will consume your empathy like a fire consumes oxygen, leaving you gasping in the emotional wasteland they've created around you. He called them parasites of the soul, though he used different words. He understood that your capacity to feel for others, when left unguarded, becomes an open door through which predators will march. Consider this. Every dictator in history began by appealing to people's empathy. Every cult leader starts by making you feel sorry for them. Every manipulator's first move is to trigger your compassion. They don't come wearing signs that say, "I will destroy you." They come wearing the masks of the wounded, the helpless, the misunderstood. They come speaking the language of pain that your empathetic heart cannot help but respond to. And here's where the plot thickens. The more empathetic you are, the more attractive you become to these emotional vampires. Your ability to understand pain makes you a magnet for those who trade in it. Your willingness to sacrifice for others signals to the world that you are available for exploitation. Your open heart becomes a welcome mat that reads, "All emotional baggage accepted here." But what if everything you've been taught about empathy is wrong? What if the very quality that makes you feel most human is the one that is slowly erasing your humanity? What if Machiavelli was right when he observed that those who give without limits inevitably find themselves with nothing left to give, not even to themselves? There's a reason why the most empathetic people often lead the most emotionally chaotic lives. There is a reason why those who care the most frequently find themselves surrounded by those who care the least. There's a reason why your kindness seems to attract cruelty, why your understanding draws in the misunderstood, why your strength becomes a beacon for the weak who have no intention of becoming strong themselves. The question that should haunt you isn't whether you re-empathetic enough. It's whether you re-foolish enough to believe that empathy without wisdom is a virtue rather than a vice. Because somewhere in the distance between caring for others and caring for yourself, you lost sight of a fundamental truth that Machiavelli understood with crystalline clarity. The person who cannot say no to others is saying no to themselves, one sacrifice at a time. To understand why empathy becomes a trap, you must first understand what Carl Jung called the shadow of compassion, the dark underbelly of our most cherished virtue that we refuse to acknowledge. Jung observed that every psychological strength carries within it the seed of its own destruction, and empathy is perhaps the most dangerous example of this principle. The problem begins in childhood, where most of us learn that love is conditional. You were praised when you shared, rewarded when you put others first, celebrated when you sacrificed your needs for someone else's comfort. Your parents, teachers, and society itself taught you that your worth was directly proportional to your usefulness to others. Without realizing it, you internalized a devastating equation. I matter only when I serve. Machiavelli understood this psychological conditioning centuries before Freud ever put pen to paper. He saw how the powerful exploit this learned helplessness, how they weaponize compassion against the compassionate. In The Prince, he wrote about the necessity of controlled cruelty, not because he was heartless, but because he understood that uncontrolled kindness invites exploitation. He knew that in a world where wolves dress as sheep, the shepherd who cannot distinguish between the two will lose his entire flock. Friedrich Nietzsche took this understanding even further. He saw Christian morality, with its emphasis on turning the other cheek, loving your enemies, and sacrificing for others, as a slave morality designed to keep the strong weak and the powerful submissive. Nietzsche argued that excessive empathy doesn't elevate humanity. It degrades it by rewarding weakness and punishing strength. When you constantly absorb others' pain without boundaries, you're not helping them transcend their suffering. You're enabling them to remain trapped in it. But the psychological roots run deeper still. Arthur Schopenhauer identified what he called the will to live, the driving force behind all human action. He observed that those who cannot assert their own will become vessels for others' wills. When you lack clear boundaries, you don't become selfless. You become a self that belongs to everyone else. Your empathy becomes a form of psychological colonization, where others occupy the territory of your mind and emotions. Consider the neurological reality of what happens when you empathize without limits. Mirror neurons fire in your brain, literally causing you to feel what others feel. But here's what science has discovered. Chronic activation of these neural pathways leads to empathic overload, a condition where you lose the ability to distinguish between your emotions and those of others. You become an emotional chameleon, constantly shifting to match the feelings of whoever is in front of you, until you forget what your authentic emotional state even feels like. Viktor Frankl, writing from the depths of a Nazi concentration camp, observed something profound about human nature. People need meaning more than they need happiness, and they need purpose more than they need comfort. But boundless empathy robs you of both meaning and purpose because it makes you reactive rather than proactive. You become a firefighter constantly responding to other people as emergencies, instead of an architect building your own life. The existentialists understood this trap perfectly. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that we are condemned to be free, meaning we cannot escape the responsibility of choosing who we become. But empathy without boundaries is a form of bad faith, a way of avoiding the anxiety of authentic choice by letting others' needs determine your actions. You tell yourself you're being noble, but you're actually being cowardly, hiding from the terrifying freedom of living according to your own values and desires. Aldous Huxley warned of a different kind of tyranny in Brave New World, one where people become enslaved not through force, but through the satisfaction of their every desire for comfort and ease. Boundless empathy creates a similar trap. You become addicted to the feeling of being needed, the rush of being someone's savior, the identity of being indispensable. But this addiction keeps you trapped in cycles of codependency that prevent both you and others from growing. The shadow of empathy reveals itself most clearly in what psychologists now call empathic distress, the overwhelming, emotional state that occurs when your capacity to feel for others exceeds your capacity to help them effectively. You feel their pain so intensely that you become paralyzed by it, less able to provide actual assistance, and more likely to make decisions based on emotional reactivity rather than rational assessment. Machiavelli saw this clearly. The leader who feels too deeply for his subjects becomes incapable of making the hard decisions necessary for their welfare. The parent who cannot bear to see their child struggle robs that child of the opportunity to develop resilience. The friend who always rushes to solve others' problems prevents them from developing their own problem-solving skills. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of empathy without boundaries is how it masquerades as spiritual enlightenment. You tell yourself that your suffering on behalf of others makes you more evolved, more conscious, more spiritually advanced. But what you actually experiencing is what Jung called inflation, the dangerous expansion of ego that comes from identifying with archetypal energies. You begin to see yourself as the wounded healer, the cosmic mother, the universal rescuer. And in doing so, you lose touch with your ordinary, flawed, beautifully human self. The tragedy is that this inflation serves no one. Others sense your need to be needed and either exploit it or resent it. They intuitively understand that your empathy comes with strings attached, that your caring is actually a form of control, your sacrifice a form of manipulation. They feel the weight of your expectations, the burden of being your opportunity for meaning, and they rebel against it or become addicted to it in equally unhealthy ways. This is the hidden problem that Machiavelli identified. Empathy without boundaries doesn't create connection. It creates entanglement. It doesn't foster love. It breeds resentment. It doesn't promote healing. It perpetuates woundedness. And most dangerously of all, it doesn't make you good. It makes you useful to those who would exploit goodness for their own ends. The consequences of boundless empathy unfold like a slow-motion catastrophe, invisible until the damage is irreversible. You don't wake up one morning suddenly depleted. You arrive there through 1,000 small surrenders, each one feeling noble in isolation, each one contributing to a pattern that will eventually consume you whole. Watch how it begins. Someone in your life discovers that you respond to emotional appeals. Maybe it's a friend who notices you can't say no when they're struggling. Maybe it's a family member who learns that mentioning their pain guarantees your compliance. Maybe it's a romantic partner who realizes your empathy can be weaponized against your own needs. They don't consciously plot your destruction. They simply follow the path of least resistance, which happens to run directly through your unguarded heart. The first consequence is what psychologists call empathic hijacking. Your nervous system becomes so attuned to others' emotional states that you lose access to your own. You walk into a room and immediately scan for who needs comfort, who appears distressed, who might benefit from your attention. Your emotional radar is constantly sweeping, searching for pain to absorb, problems to solve, people to rescue. But in this constant outward focus, something terrifying happens. You forget how to look inward. Your own needs become background noise. Your desires fade into whispers. Your dreams get filed away under some day when everyone else is okay. But here's the cruel irony: everyone else is never okay. There will always be another crisis, another emergency, another person who really needs you right now. The empathetic person's calendar is never their own. It belongs to whoever can make the most compelling case for their suffering. This leads to what Machiavelli understood as the virtue trap. The more virtuous you appear, the more you attract those who lack virtue. Your reputation for kindness becomes a beacon for the unkind. Your willingness to forgive draws in those who have no intention of changing their behavior. Your capacity for understanding becomes a magnet for those who use being misunderstood as a manipulation tactic. Consider the cognitive biases that fuel this destructive cycle. The sunk cost fallacy makes you believe that because you've already invested so much emotional energy in someone, you must continue investing. The confirmation bias causes you to interpret every small gesture as proof that your sacrifice is working, that you're getting through to them. The hero complex convinces you that you're the only one who can save them, that without your intervention, they'll be lost forever. But perhaps the most insidious consequence is how boundless empathy rewires your brain for dependency. Not their dependency on you, but your dependency on being needed. Neuroscience reveals that acts of caregiving trigger the release of oxytocin and dopamine, creating a biochemical reward system that can become addictive. You begin to crave the feeling of being essential, the rush of being someone's savior, the identity of being irreplaceable. Without realizing it, you become psychologically dependent on others' dysfunction because their healing would eliminate your purpose. This creates what therapists call trauma bonding, an unhealthy attachment formed through cycles of crisis and rescue. You mistake intensity for intimacy, chaos for connection, drama for depth. Your relationships become defined not by mutual growth and joy, but by patterns of breakdown and repair, abandonment and rescue, crisis and relief. You confuse being needed with being loved, and in doing so, you attract people who can offer the former, but are incapable of the latter. The social consequences extend far beyond individual relationships. In families, the boundlessly empathetic person becomes the identified patient, the one who absorbs all the dysfunction, carries all the emotional labor, and maintains the illusion that everything is fine. They become the shock absorber for the family system, which means the system never has to change or heal because the empathetic member is managing all the symptoms. In workplaces, they become the emotional janitors, cleaning up after colleagues' mistakes, staying late to cover for others' incompetence, absorbing criticism that should be directed elsewhere. Their competence and reliability become weapons used against them, as management learns they can be counted on to sacrifice their own well-being for the team's success. They become indispensable in the most destructive way possible, not because they're particularly skilled, but because they're willing to accept unacceptable treatment. The cultural implications are equally devastating. A society that celebrates boundless empathy is a society that rewards victimhood and punishes strength. It creates perverse incentives where displaying pain becomes more valuable than developing resilience, where claiming to be hurt carries more weight than taking responsibility for healing. It produces what psychologists call victim Olympics competitive, suffering where people vie for who has endured the most trauma, who deserves the most sympathy, who has the most compelling claim on others' empathy. This cultural shift has created what Machiavelli would recognize as a dangerous inversion of power dynamics. Those who should be helping themselves learn to weaponize their helplessness. Those who should be growing stronger learn to profit from their weakness. Those who should be taking responsibility learn to make their irresponsibility everyone else's problem. And the empathetic members of society become unwitting enablers of this dysfunction, their kindness feeding a system that rewards manipulation and punishes authenticity. The most tragic consequence is how this pattern destroys the very thing empathy is meant to create: genuine connection. When your empathy has no boundaries, others never learn to regulate their own emotions. They never develop resilience because you're always there to absorb their pain. They never discover their own strength because you're always providing yours. They never learn self-sufficiency because your availability makes it unnecessary. You become like a parent who never lets their child fall, never lets them struggle, never allows them to experience the natural consequences of their choices. Your empathy becomes a form of emotional helicopter parenting that stunts everyone's growth, including your own. You rob others of the opportunity to develop their own coping skills, their own problem-solving abilities, their own emotional intelligence. Meanwhile, you're developing what psychologists call empathy fatigue, a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion caused by caring for others in distress. Your nervous system remains in a constant state of activation, always ready to respond to the next crisis. You lose the ability to relax, to be present with joy, to experience the simple pleasure of a moment without scanning for who might need your help. The final consequence is perhaps the most heartbreaking. You become a stranger to yourself. After years of living in response to others' needs, you discover you don't know what you actually want, what you genuinely enjoy, what brings you authentic satisfaction. You've become so skilled at reading others that you've lost the ability to read yourself. You can sense everyone else's emotions with startling accuracy, but your own inner landscape has become foreign territory. This is the ultimate price of empathy without boundaries. You save everyone except yourself. Understand everyone except yourself. Love everyone except yourself. And in the end, you find yourself surrounded by people whose problems you've managed, but whose growth you've prevented, whose pain you've absorbed, but whose healing you've delayed, whose lives you've improved while your own has slowly disappeared. The path to freedom begins with a single revolutionary act, the decision to betray your own conditioning. Everything you've been taught about empathy, everything society has praised you for, everything that has defined your identity as a good person, you must be willing to question it all. This is not about becoming heartless. This is about becoming strategically compassionate, consciously selective, deliberately boundaried. Machiavelli understood that true power comes not from the ability to help everyone, but from the wisdom to know whom to help, when to help, and most importantly, when not to help. He saw that the leader who tries to save everyone ends up saving no one, while the leader who chooses his battles carefully can actually create lasting change. This principle applies to your personal life with devastating effectiveness. The first rebellion is learning to distinguish between empathy and enabling. True empathy seeks to understand others' pain in order to help them transcend it. Enabling, disguised as empathy, seeks to absorb others' pain in order to feel needed, important, or morally superior. The difference is subtle but crucial. Empathy empowers others to grow, while enabling empowers them to remain stuck. When you constantly rescue someone from the consequences of their choices, you're not being empathetic, you're being an accomplice to their stagnation. Consider how Machiavelli's concept of virtuous cruelty applies here. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is refuse to help. Sometimes the kindest response is to let someone struggle. Sometimes the most loving action is to step back and allow natural consequences to unfold. This isn't heartlessness, it's wisdom. It's the recognition that your empathy, when misapplied, can become an obstacle to others' growth rather than a catalyst for it. The second rebellion involves reclaiming your emotional sovereignty. You must learn to create what psychologists call emotional firewalls, protective barriers that allow you to understand others' pain without absorbing it, to witness their struggles without making them your own. This requires developing what Buddhists call compassionate detachment, the ability to care deeply while remaining centered in your own emotional truth. This is where Machiavelli's strategic thinking becomes invaluable. Just as he advised rulers to form alliances based on mutual benefit rather than sentiment, you must learn to engage in relationships based on reciprocity rather than rescue. You must ask yourself, is this person capable of growth, or are they addicted to being saved? Are they seeking solutions, or are they seeking sympathy? Are they willing to do the work, or do they expect me to do it for them? The ancient Stoics provided a framework for this rebellion through their concept of the dichotomy of control. Marcus Aurelius understood that you can control your actions, your responses, and your boundaries, but you cannot control others' emotions, choices, or outcomes. When you try to manage others' feelings or fix their problems, you're attempting to control what is fundamentally uncontrollable. This is not compassion. It's a form of psychological colonialism that serves no one. Historical examples illuminate this principle powerfully. Consider Florence Nightingale, often romanticized as the epitome of feminine compassion. But Nightingale's true genius wasn't her endless empathy. It was her strategic ruthlessness. She revolutionized healthcare not by feeling everyone's pain, but by systematically addressing the causes of suffering. She created boundaries, established protocols, and refused to enable the very systems that perpetuated the problems she sought to solve. Her compassion was bounded, directed, and therefore effective. Or examine Gandhi's approach to social change. Gandhi didn't absorb the suffering of the oppressed, he transformed it into action. He didn't enable victimhood, he empowered resistance. His empathy was coupled with an almost ruthless discipline about what he would and wouldn't accept, what he would and wouldn't tolerate. His compassion had edges, boundaries, limits that made it powerful rather than depleting. The third rebellion requires you to develop what Nietzsche called noble selfishness, the recognition that taking care of yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. You cannot give what you don't have. You cannot offer strength while remaining weak. You cannot provide clarity while living in confusion. The oxygen mask principle applies here. You must secure your own emotional well-being before attempting to help others with theirs. This means learning to say no without guilt, to prioritize your needs without shame, to set boundaries without apology. It means recognizing that your time, energy, and emotional capacity are finite resources that must be allocated strategically rather than scattered indiscriminately. It means understanding that saying yes to everyone means saying no to yourself, and ultimately saying no to the possibility of making a meaningful difference in anyone's life. The fourth rebellion involves developing what Machiavelli would recognize as emotional intelligence coupled with strategic thinking. You must learn to read people's true motivations, not just their stated needs. You must distinguish between those who are temporarily struggling and those who are professionally victimized. You must identify the difference between someone who needs support and someone who needs to be needed. This requires developing what psychologists call manipulative awareness, the ability to recognize when your empathy is being weaponized against you. Learn the signs. People who only contact you when they need something, who share their problems but never ask about yours, who respond to your boundaries with guilt trips, who seem to have a new crisis every time you try to focus on your own life. These patterns reveal the difference between authentic connection and emotional exploitation. The final rebellion is perhaps the most difficult. You must be willing to lose people who cannot accept your boundaries. Some relationships exist only because of your boundless availability. Some people love you only for what you provide, not for who you are. When you begin setting limits, you'll discover who was there for you and who was there for what you could offer them. This revelation can be painful, but it's also liberating. It's the difference between being surrounded by people who use you and being connected to people who see you. Remember, Machiavelli wrote The Prince not to celebrate cruelty, but to acknowledge reality. He understood that in a world where wolves exist, sheep who refuse to recognize this fact will be devoured. Your empathy without boundaries doesn't make you virtuous. It makes you vulnerable. But empathy with boundaries, compassion with wisdom, kindness with limits, this creates the possibility for authentic relationships, genuine healing, and lasting change. The rebellion begins the moment you realize that protecting your own emotional well-being is unselfish. It's the prerequisite for being genuinely helpful to others. It's the moment you understand that boundaries aren't walls that keep love out. They're fences that keep love safe. Here is the truth that will shatter everything you thought you knew about compassion. The people who truly love you want you to have boundaries. They want you to say no when you need to say no. They want you to prioritize your well-being, pursue your dreams, and live according to your own values. Anyone who demands your boundless empathy, who guilts you for having limits, who makes your boundaries about their rejection, they don't love you. They love what you do for them. This is Machiavelli's ultimate insight, the one that transforms everything. Authentic love seeks the beloved's highest good, even when that good requires temporary discomfort or disappointment. Manipulation masquerades as need, but real connection celebrates boundaries as the foundation of respect. When you finally understand this distinction, you realize that most of what you called love was actually a complex web of mutual exploitation disguised as virtue. The most profound truth about empathy is that it becomes sacred only when it is chosen rather than compelled, conscious rather than compulsive, strategic rather than scattershot. The empathy that flows from your own fullness is qualitatively different from the empathy that emerges from your emptiness. When you help others from a place of strength, choice, and genuine care, your compassion becomes a gift. When you help others from a place of guilt, obligation, or the need to be needed, your compassion becomes a transaction. Consider this paradigm-shifting realization. The universe doesn't need you to sacrifice yourself for others. In fact, your self-sacrifice often prevents the very growth and healing you're trying to facilitate. When you constantly rescue others from their struggles, you rob them of their hero's journey. When you absorb their pain, you prevent them from developing their own emotional resilience. When you solve their problems, you deny them the satisfaction and confidence that comes from solving their own problems. This is what Machiavelli understood about power. True power empowers others, while false power creates dependency. A leader who makes his people dependent on him for every decision weakens his kingdom. A parent who prevents their child from ever struggling raises a weak adult. A friend who never allows others to reciprocate creates relationships based on inequality rather than mutuality. Your boundless empathy, however well-intentioned, often functions as a subtle form of control. It keeps others small while making you feel important. The ultimate truth is that your empathy without boundaries doesn't serve love, it serves your ego. It feeds your identity as the rescuer, the caretaker, the indispensable one. It satisfies your need to feel needed, your desire to be seen as good, your fear of being ordinary. But this is not love. This is narcissism wearing the mask of compassion. True love sometimes requires you to step back, to trust others' capacity for growth, to honor their right to struggle and learn and become strong. Here is the paradox that will revolutionize your relationships. The less available you become for others' dysfunction, the more available you become for their authentic selves. When you stop enabling their weakness, you create space for their strength to emerge. When you stop absorbing their pain, you force them to develop their own emotional processing skills. When you stop solving their problems, you communicate your belief in their capability to solve their own problems. This shift creates what psychologists call secure attachment, relationships based on mutual respect, reciprocity, and the assumption that both people are capable, worthy, and whole. It replaces the anxious attachment of codependency with the calm confidence of interdependence. It transforms relationships from emergency rooms into gardens, from crisis management into collaborative growth. But perhaps the most liberating truth is this: you are not responsible for managing other people's emotions. You are not required to make others happy at the expense of your own well-being. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. The people who truly belong in your life will understand this. They will respect your boundaries, not as rejection, but as self-respect. They will celebrate your growth not as abandonment, but as inspiration. The final revelation that Machiavelli would recognize is that strategic compassion, empathy with boundaries, kindness with limits, love with conditions, is not a lesser form of caring. It is a higher form. It requires more wisdom, more courage, more genuine concern for others' long-term welfare than boundless empathy ever could. It asks you to care enough about others to refuse to enable their dysfunction. It demands that you love them enough to let them struggle, grow, and become strong. When you finally integrate this truth, something magical happens. Your relationships transform from transactions into connections, from obligations into choices, from drains on your energy into sources of mutual nourishment. You discover that having boundaries doesn't make you less loving. It makes your love more precious because it is freely given rather than compulsively extracted. You realize that saying no to what doesn't serve, you create space to say yes to what does. You understand that protecting your own well-being isn't selfish. It's the foundation for genuine service to others. You see that your authentic self, complete with limits and boundaries and conditions, is infinitely more valuable than your sacrificial self, endlessly available and perpetually depleted. This is the truth that sets you free. You were never meant to save everyone. You were meant to save yourself, and in doing so, model for others what salvation looks like. You were never supposed to absorb everyone's pain. You were supposed to transform your own pain into wisdom and offer that wisdom to those ready to receive it. You were never required to love without limits. You are called to love with such precision, such intentionality, such strategic compassion that your love becomes a force for genuine transformation rather than comfortable stagnation. In the end, Machiavelli's gift to you is not cynicism, it's clarity. The clarity to see that true compassion requires discernment, that authentic love demands boundaries, and that the highest form of empathy is the kind that empowers others to develop their own capacity for empathy. This is not the death of your caring heart. It is its rebirth as something infinitely more powerful. A heart that cares strategically, loves consciously, and serves from a place of strength rather than depletion. The moment you embrace this truth, you stop being a victim of your own virtue and become the conscious architect of your own compassion. And that, perhaps, is the most empathetic thing you could ever do for yourself and for everyone whose life you touch.